This is the We Witches 3 podcast, where you will hear the opinion of 3 seasoned witches who are tired of glossy, tunnel vision, love and light accolades about serious metaphysical topics. Your host, Charlene, Maria Sewell, and Heather Woodworth have been practicing witches and professional psychics for over 20 years. They not only have the experience, but they have the research to back it up. So get comfortable on your brooms, grab a snack, and get ready for a wild ride.
Hey everybody, this is Nathara at We Witches 3. Today we're going to be taking on kind of a heavier topic. We're going to be talking about cultural appropriation. So right up front, I want to give you a couple trigger warnings. We're going to be talking about violence, and we're going to be talking about racism. We might be talking about a couple other things as well. So if you have issues around those topics, you're probably going to want to bail out now. But I do want to be upfront and say that this is going to be a triggering topic for a lot of people. And I know that whenever I have engaged in this conversation with people, there's usually a lot of protest and people get really sensitive about it, and it brings up a lot of feelings. So just a heads up that that's probably going to happen. That being said, thank you if you've stuck around. Let's start out talking about what cultural appropriation is to begin with, because there's a lot of confusion around the very basic definition of what we're referring to when we're talking about cultural appropriation. Cultural appropriation is when somebody from the dominant culture takes something from a less dominant culture and profits from it in some way, be that reputation, popularity, expertise, or actual raw money. Now, that profit margin is how we separate the difference between appropriation and appreciation. So starting right out the gate, I'm going to say that I enjoy making Indian food. Indian from India, because a lot of Americans still use Indian to refer to Native Americans, and so I am having to make this clarification that when I say Indian, I mean people from India. I enjoy cooking Indian food. Now, I'm saying that not for reputation points here at all, but that this is something that I do, and I make this food for my family at home. And I can do that. I am allowed to partake in other cultures, and other cultures are allowed to partake in whatever they want to do as well. But I would be crossing the line very much if I, as a white lady, were to open an Indian restaurant. At that point, I would be profiting off the production of goods and items from another culture that I am not part of. Especially because the Indian restaurants here in the town where I live are all run by actual Indian people. And there is an issue where people are more comfortable because of racism going to a business from a white person than they are going to the culture themselves. People like to enjoy things from other cultures without actually having to experience that other culture. And this is a huge issue that we have, especially in the US, that is solidly founded on racism. And a lot of people make the excuse that they don't like to go to those parts of town or sketchy neighborhoods or whatever, but that's all just thinly veiled comments about racism. So it's implicit bias, like maybe you don't feel like you're racist, you just don't like to go to neighborhoods where there aren't a lot of white people, and that, my friends, is internalized implicit racism. And we all carry that to some degree. It's just a fact of life, but it needs to be worked on. Like, we all need to do our parts to get better about it. So I'm not going to say that I'm not at least a little bit racist, because I know that I carry that with me, and it's something that has been taught to me, and there's no escaping it. But I'm trying, and trying is kind of like the best that I can really do. And of course, the ideal is that someday I will have unlearned all that stuff, but also my odds are not that great of ever actually achieving that, but I'm gonna work on it. So we have this definition of cultural appropriation where you can actually participate in the traditions and goods and the works of other cultures, but if you're in the dominant culture, it's not okay to profit off those pursuits especially when people from that culture themselves cannot profit from whatever that thing is either. We see this in a lot of different ways. For instance, I'm going to make another confession here. Years ago, I had another personal website on the internet under another name, and I used to call myself a shaman. Now, I do not practice Native American shamanism. I never set myself up to be a white plastic shaman. I didn't go to any classes. I know that's a whole other issue. I practiced Norse shamanism, Northern European variety shamanism, but I felt the word shaman fit my practices, my religious and magical practices, much better than the word witch did. And so I used the word shaman for myself instead of witch. And I ended up running into the issue where everyone I talked to believed that by shaman, I meant Native American shaman. And so, through many arguments and debates, mostly with myself, I determined that just using the word shaman was culturally appropriative because the traffic that I was getting was from people who were looking for Native American shamanism and information on that. And that the fact that most people in society don't realize there are other cultures that practice shamanism meant that I was inadvertently practicing cultural appropriation and putting myself forward in a profession I didn't even mean to be taking over with my white self. So I changed my words, I changed my website, I got a whole new domain address, and now I use the word witch instead. And so that's the way that is. So I learned that just by using the word shamanism, I was intruding on what our normal culture considers Native American practice. And so I needed to recognize that. And instead of thinking, I'm going to retake the word and show people that there's more than one kind of shamanism, I realized that culture and society being what it is, I needed to leave that to Native Americans because that's how we associate that word. And so, so there's a lot of cultural appropriation that happens, and you can be culturally appropriating and not realize it. And I want to say right now that just because you might do some racist things with the implicit racism, and we talked about that already, and just because you might be accidentally culturally appropriating because you don't know better, because you're not familiar with a topic, doesn't mean you're a bad person. But I am going to tell you that you could do a lot better, especially because you're listening to this podcast right now. And that's the important thing that we need to talk about. We have this weird thing in our society where we think that racists are bad, and people who are intentionally, knowingly racists are definitely bad people. But all of us experience some kind of internalized implicit racism, and we can do better, but that doesn't make us bad people. Cultural appropriation is part of that bag. Let's talk about how people get it wrong. Okay, because this is another major issue and it comes up a lot in conversations of cultural appropriation. The most common way that people get this wrong is to say that you cannot practice anything that does not come from your particular ethnic culture. That simply means white people can only do white people things. Mexican people can only do Mexican things, Native Americans can only do Native American things, and such like. And yes, there are honestly people in this world who truly, truly believe that this is the only ethical way to do things. I have literally left Discord servers over this because the moderators there believed that I was being culturally appropriative by simply owning a Santa Muerte Oracle deck. Now, I would never use my Santa Muerte Oracle deck for clients, and I would never purport or sell myself as a follower of Santa Muerte. I am not a follower of Santa Muerte. But I did buy the deck, and the deck is not targeted at followers of Santa Muerte. It is not marketed that way, and there's no claim that I would make to being a devotee of Santa Muerte. Now, just because I'm white doesn't mean I can't be a devotee of Santa Muerte. Santa Muerte accepts who she wants to accept. She's a freaking goddess, and she can do that. I have no say whatsoever over that, and I think that anyone down here among us, basic humans, has no right to say what the gods can and can't do. That's absolutely ridiculous. So you can absolutely be white and follow Santa Muerte and be a devotee of hers if you want, but to sell yourself that way, to make a profit off that devotion, or relationship is an entirely different matter, because then you're taking the reputation and hard-earned money away from people of the culture who then end up being shut out of those opportunities because there's a much more palatable white person providing those services. So yes, people get it very, very wrong. Well-intentioned people get it very, very wrong, and they think that there's these rigid rules, and oh gosh, do humans love their fucking rules, right? We love nice, rigid rules where we don't have to take things in context, where we can think, okay, white people to white things, black people to black things, Mexicans can only practice their Mexican stuff, and that's not the way it is. Cultural exchange is a really real thing that we can do, and cultural appreciation is a great thing too, but we have to remember that context is super, super important, and then that there is a cultural power dynamic at play. Another thing I want to discuss is, in this conversation, a lot of times we have an issue where white people do not like being called white people. I was having a conversation in one of the groups that I'm in, and someone equated being referred to as a white person with another ethnicity being called a racial slur. And they were very specific about the racial slur and the other ethnicity and all that stuff. But this is not an equivalency. This is not true in any way. But we white people, we're funny about these things. There's a lot of discussion about why this happens and why we have this reaction to being called white people. And the one that I think rings truest in my experience from what I've seen and my own internal feelings is that as white people, we're so used to being the default race or the default people that people are referring to when they're just talking about people, that we're not used to being addressed by our race. And so being called out or referred to by our race specifically feels discriminatory because we think of ourselves just as people and we don't identify ourselves as white people. We are just people. We are the default. And so being called out by our race feels racist, even though everybody else in society has to have that racial filter on their perceptions all the time. We have this incredible privilege, and yeah, I'm using the word privilege, of going around and not having to identify ourselves by our race. And so being identified that way suddenly feels discriminatory when it's absolutely not. It's just what everybody else on the planet feels on a day-to-day basis. It's just a fact of life. We are white, and what else are you gonna call us? So this weird offense that white people get at being called white is really, really weird. And I know it feels really weird to every other, race and ethnicity out there. And yeah, it feels weird to me too. What else? I would rather you not come up with a racial slur. I'm not going to be more comfortable with that. I am white and I don't know what else you're going to call me. So white people, yeah, we're white, and being called white people is not offensive. So get over it is what I'm trying to say. What else are you going to be called? So let's go back to the basics again, right? So a lot of times we have the cultural appropriation conversation. We start out talking about Halloween costumes, and we all get the Halloween costumes are wrong. If you're going to put on a Native American outfit or whatever, a Pocahontas costume or a little feather costume for Halloween, we all know those are wrong. Or if you're going to put on a poncho and a sombrero for Halloween, we know that's wrong. That's wrong because it's culturally appropriation. It's taking cultural markers out of context in a humorous manner. It's racist. We know that. We recognize that it's racist and it's wrong because being another race for Halloween is offensive, right? And so we can take that and we can take it a step further and be, okay, even if you love those races and those cultures and you want to dress up for them as Halloween, it's still not okay. We understand that. We've had this conversation a lot of years now. And so we understand that. But then we have to take that a step further. And we're finally getting to the place where we understand, for the most part, that using other races and ethnicities and cultures as sports mascots is also not okay. You can be, a scary bear for your sports team, but it's not okay to be a scary Native American. That's not okay. That is racist and cultural appropriation. You can't take the symbol of the Native American and use it for your sports ball team and have that be all right. And it's not okay for your fans to show up in Native American inspired headdresses and stuff. Like, this is not okay. This is culturally appropriative, right? And I think the major conversation on the internet especially got started when people were wearing similar headdresses and stuff to Burning Man. Like, this is where the conversation got really obvious to me and kind of where I got sucked into it, right? Where people were wearing feathers and native headdresses and stuff to Burning Man. And the big argument there is they were saying, no, this isn't appropriative, this is appreciation. We're wearing the headdresses to show that we are spiritually liberated, that we love the Native Americans, and blah, blah, blah. But they weren't recognizing that, one, headdresses have a very specific place in Native American culture, like they signify different ranks and achievements and other such things in Native American culture, so you actually have to earn your headdresses before you're allowed to wear them. They're not just like accessories, which is how people were wearing them. They were just wearing them as like decorative adornments that anyone can wear, and you can just go buy them from a shop and then decide that this is today's latest fashion, which is not how they're treated in Native American culture. And so doing so, like taking a sacred object out of context and using it for fashion, is fucking disrespectful, obviously. But people were trying to show that they were doing it out of appreciation, which is probably true. Those people probably really do have a lot of respect for Native American culture, but they were being incredibly insulting in the process. And so instead of approaching the context where they were being told, like, hey, you're being incredibly offensive right now, they were saying, no, I'm not. I'm being appreciative. And also, by the way, if you could be a lot nicer about how you addressed us, about how offensive we are right now, we might have considered listening to you. And so also that offense where people are like, look, I get that I offended you, but if you could have been a whole lot nicer about telling me how offensive I am, I might have considered listening to you, is a weird thing that people do. And it really is like this really weird, incredible, like, if you're offensive to someone and they took the time to tell you, like, hey man, you're being offensive right now, that was already nice of them. Like, those people could have just hated you and talked shit about you behind your back. And that's usually what people do in society. For someone to come forward to you and be like, hey, that was offensive, what you did right there, is already a kindness, because just in saying that much, they're saying, I think you're a person who does not mean to be offensive, and I feel like you need to know that what you did was offensive, because you will do better if you know that. And I think people don't realize that that's what that statement means. Like, people don't say that to people they think are trying to be offensive. They just go, that person's an ass, and we all fucking know it. So if you're being told that you're being offensive by someone, that person in their heart believes you don't intend it. They don't think you mean to be offensive. And so already they're doing a nicety for you by educating you and helping you continue to not be offensive as much as possible. So insisting that they're nicer about it when they don't have to be and they're already doing you a favor is kind of an asshole thing to do. So don't fucking do that, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so another topic that came up, and now I'm going to be talking to my new agers and my witchy folk, right? Because this is a witchy fucking podcast. So another topic that came up recently, and we touched on this briefly with Sephora, and when we did our Sephora Witchcraft Kit podcast, that is when we got the request to do this podcast on cultural appropriation too. We got a lot of comments for it, and I've just been kind of percolating on this podcast topic for literally months now before getting around to doing it. I was a little overwhelmed because I knew that like editing it was going to be really hard. I was going to have a lot of information to present, and I didn't want to be too offensive, and I didn't want to fuck it up, but here we go, right? So, talking to my witches and my new agers here, we're going to talk about sage right now. Sage and smudging and smoke cleansing, because this is a whole barrel of cultural appropriation, right? Y'all know I, Nathara / Charlene, if you've forgotten who's speaking right now, I have been in the New Age game since I was like 6 years old, right? My mom was a Rosicrucian. I'm just reminding you of my background here. So I have been doing the saging thing for like my whole fucking life. Sage is the one that gets passed around all the time, and I can tell you that the reason we use sage is because we got this practice from Native Americans. Now, I also want to take this moment to remind you that Native Americans are not only from North America, but when we say Native Americans, we're also referring to the Native Americans from South America and Central America too, okay? That's not just a Northern American thing. But yeah, so we got this practice from Native Americans. They don't use sage this way in Europe, okay? They just don't. I mean, they do now, but they don't historically, because sage doesn't grow in Europe natively. So already using sage to smoke cleanse is a culturally appropriative practice. Now, there are a lot of posts on the internet about how smudging is culturally appropriative, and it is. Okay, it totally fucking is culturally appropriative. Even more so when you consider that we use the word smudging most of the time when we're talking about using the sage to smoke cleanse. Now, there's a lot of arguing going on because there's a lot of information out there talking about how no, you as a witch or a new ager or a psychic or whatever you identify yourself as being are not smudging. You cannot smudge because you do not have the initiations and you do not know the sacred rituals that constitute smudging, because in Native American practice, it is not just waving your sage around in an area to cleanse the energies. Smudging is actually a ritual or ceremonial practice that has a lot of other elements involved. Those elements I don't know. Okay, I just know there are more elements. I mean, I've read about it before. I've forgotten. It's not my business. I haven't been initiated and I haven't been trained. So if you really, really want to know, you can go do some research and find out what all smudging involves. But it is not just waving sage around. There's more involved. What we do with sage is smoke cleansing, and smoke cleansing is perfectly valid. It will take care of the energy and vibes in your home or your tarot cards or your crystals or your person or whatever the fuck you're trying to cleanse. But it is smoke cleansing. In Europe and other cultures, they also do this with herbs, but they do not do it with sage. They do it with rosemary or lavender or cedar or a variety of other herbs. Like, sage is not the only one. And the reason why sage becomes such an issue is because it is mostly harvested here in North America. And in the Native American traditions, for most tribes, now, treating Native American tribes as if they're homogenous is a huge mistake to begin with. But for most tribes, their practices involve harvesting the sage wild. And because there is such a huge demand on the market for metaphysical shops and new agers and those kind of customers for the white sage, it is becoming very difficult to find it in the wild. And so now the Native Americans are having a hard time getting a hold of their very particular sacred plant and harvesting it wild like they need to for their ceremonies. And so that's pretty rude ass of us white people to be doing to them. Yes, using the sage in our new age practice and our witchy rituals and stuff is very culturally appropriative, because we did absolutely get that practice from native peoples, and using the word smudge to describe what we're doing is adding insult to injury, because not only are we uplifting ourselves, putting our metaphysical reputations further and spiritual advancement, but our stores and stuff are making a profit off their sacred plants and also depriving them of its use in the process. So that's a fucking asshole thing for us to do. That is definitely us pulling our whole dominant culture BS over a less dominant culture. In fact, a very, very marginalized culture in our society. You can use a ton of variety of different herbs and stuff for your smoke cleansing, and smoke cleansing is totally effective. You don't need the special ceremonies and rituals that Native Americans have in order to cleanse your home of negative energies, or you can make up your own if that makes you happy. I know a lot of people do that already, but what we're doing is not smudging, and using the word smudge is disrespectful and it is culturally appropriative. When it comes to buying your sage, if you want to insist on using sage because you're super attached to sage or you just really love the smell, try to buy your sage from Native American sellers. Support their communities, because dude, what we have done to them has been terrible. Like, the way we treat them and forcing them onto reservations in order to have their sovereignty is a horrible thing. And I was taught growing up that reservations were outside of US law, but it turns out that's complete bullshit. So if you were taught that like I was, I hate to be the one to inform you that it's not true, and that the federal government still holds sway over them and still messes with them It's really, really terrible. So like if we can support them, it's all the better. And you also have the option of just growing your own sage if you want to do that. That way you're not worried about using vendors that are taking sage away from Native Americans, who are harvesting it from the wild, from places that they're not supposed to, and keeping it from the native peoples who really, really need it because they're so marginalized. I grow sage here at my home. Sage, though, is not my favorite, honestly, to use for smoke cleansing, but I know that sometimes people really want sage to be used, and I do use it sometimes in other spells and whatnot for other purposes, but I actually prefer using lavender and rosemary personally. And also, like, in case you don't know, I freaking love Palo Santo too, and it has a very similar issue coming from South America instead. Like, the illegal harvesting by companies in order to feed the New Age community is ridiculous, and it's a very sacred plant to people in South America and Peru that you have to double check all your ethical sources if you're going to be buying that one too. So that's a whole major issue. But if you grow your own herbs in your own garden or even in your own planters on your windowsill, you don't have to worry about those issues so much, and you can use them for smoke cleansing in your sacred rituals all you want without having to worry about being in competition with, indigenous cultures and taking away their resources in the process. But also remember that you're smoke cleansing instead of smudging, because you are not smudging unless you have also had the appropriate initiations and cultural training, like in the ceremonies and rituals that the Native American peoples do as well. So, and that was the issue with the Sephora Witch Kit selling the sage bundle, the smudge stick. You can't see my bunny ears on that one, but that was the issue with them selling a smudge stick in their witchcraft kit. That was a whole separate issue from whether or not people felt that the witchcraft kit in itself was just some kind of cultural appropriation. So now, we have a whole separate issue, and I mentioned this on my personal YouTube channel, but for those of you who haven't seen that video, I've been doing a lot of research lately, and having some discussions on the internet and stuff where other people have been doing research too, but the whole modern witchcraft movement and the whole New Age movement in general is very culturally appropriative. We talk about things like using our chakras, and we talk about meditation, and we talk about doing yoga, and we talk about our different spell systems and stuff, and we've taken so many of these things from other cultures. Chakras and yoga are Indian practices, and so yeah, we're taking these things and we're treating them like our own, like it's part of our own culture. And I'm sure a vast majority of people don't even realize that they're not just standard issue occult practices, but they aren't. They're actually from other cultures' religious practices. And even modern witchcraft, when you learn about doing that, we took so much occult practice from Egyptian culture, and we took so much of it from, voodoo and hoodoo, and we took so much of it from other African tribes as well, and we just took and Asian practices and such, even the inspiration for Gardner's Wicca took from all those sources as well. That modern witchcraft, as we learn it, with all these modern books and stuff, is very appropriative. And then we have people turning around and saying oh, I'm this great witch. White people turning around saying I'm this great witch, I have all these ancient practices going back all these, thousands and thousands of years, but those ancient practices are all from marginalized cultures and stuff, and it's very, very ethically sticky at best, and it's definitely culturally appropriative. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that white people don't have chakras. That would be so weird if we lived in a world where Indian people had chakras and nobody else had chakras. That is seriously not what I'm saying, because I believe in chakras and I think everybody has chakras, but separating the belief, practice, and use of chakras from the culture that discovered and originally practiced with them is, for one, losing a lot of information that we really, really need, and also not showing the appropriate appreciation that we should have, and also kind of giving ourselves credit where we don't deserve that credit. And so that's the major issue I'm talking about here. What happened to European witchcraft, Europe, where most white people are from originally, is the church wiped out the witches either through assimilation or death. We all know that witch hunts were a real thing. The pagans were very discriminated against in Europe, and so what traditions they couldn't eradicate, they assimilated into church practice. So we know this is true through the Christian holidays. Most of the Christian holidays were originally pagan holidays of one variety or another, and the church practices are the same. Lighting candles to saints was originally just a pagan witchcraft practice. So I'm working on studying like the church ritual practices so that I can like re-separate them back into their original pagan origins and like reconstruct them back into pagan practices again. I know I'm not ever gonna know the true original pagan practices, but I know that like if I look at the church practices and I can compare it to folk tales and old songs and stuff, I'll be able to reconstruct something pretty similar. But the modern witchcraft movement, as you look at it now, is largely appropriative of other cultures that we've had access to, and like that's really great. Like those magical practices absolutely work, but it's kind of like it makes you wonder that because, white people had this over dominance of Christian culture that we lost our own indigenous practices. And so then in the modern day, we went around taking everybody else's and then trying to sell it back to them. Like we take other people's indigenous practices and then lift ourselves up as if we have some great spiritual enlightenment and then turn around and try to sell it back to everybody. It's so weird. And like, again, you can use those things for your own personal use, but then you see like the commercialism of witchcraft, on the internet and in everyday life, and you realize that like we're marketing something that we're simultaneously discriminating against other people for practicing. So, here we are like trying to, in modern witchcraft, like lift ourselves up as being counterculture and activists and rebel girls and girl bosses and whatever. And at the same time, we're like looking down on our fellow brujas and whatnot as being, black magic practitioners or uneducated or doing that old stuff or whatever, when like really we're just taking their stuff. And this is a real issue in the modern witchy culture that we need to look at and examine, because it's shady and it's cruel and it's dishonest. And so we have a lot of opportunity, especially with all the knowledge that is available to us, not just through the internet, but through all the different research and educational professions that are out there, to realize what it is that is going on in the world today. Our educational opportunities right now are at such an incredible height that we have the opportunity to do a lot of good in this world and to each other, to and with each other. And there's no reason we shouldn't be taking those opportunities except ignorance. And now that we have a proliferation of YouTube and podcasting, we're able to kind of eliminate that ignorance. So I know I'm just hitting the very tippy tip top of the iceberg here, and I am also positive I have gotten some things wrong in this podcast as well, so you can expect that I'm going to be coming back and adding additional notes here and there. But let's definitely have a discussion. Let's get this work done. Let's do better, everybody. Like, we can be appreciative of each other's cultures and we can absolutely learn from each other, but in that process, let's be respectful of where we're learning things from, who we're getting things from, and what cultures we can lift up along with our own. We don't want to be profiting all by ourselves. We don't want to be perpetuating inequality in society. If we're going to be these great witches and metaphysicians and psychics and whatnot, we don't want to contribute to the imbalance in society. We want to have that pushback in society. We want to be the counterculture people who say this isn't right. We're not going to continue doing this whole cultural dominance that has been happening since the dawn of history. We're going to stop it. We're going to lift each other up as appropriate and move everybody forward at once. And by recognizing our own implicit bias, our own implicit racism, and the way cultural appropriation is built into how we're taught to do things, we can start eliminating it and righting the balance in society. Again, I want to reiterate, when you discover that you are carrying this internalized implicit racism and you are perpetuating cultural appropriation, it is not to say that you're doing these things on purpose, and it does not make you a bad person. But once you know better, you've got to do better. If you know better and then you're like, no, this is fine, I would like to carry on doing it, that's when we start to wonder what kind of person you are and where your ethics are at. But ignorance is ignorance, and you can't be held accountable for what you did when you were ignorant. You just got to do better once you know better. And that's what this podcast is all about. That's what all of our podcasts are all about. We bring up these issues so that everybody can kind of have a conversation. We can learn from each other, and then we can all do better. Although sometimes we're just venting. So please take that note when you're listening to this podcast on cultural appropriation as well. I'm not perfect. I have a lot to learn. I'm positive I'm going to get comments back about things that I said here and ways that I have accidentally done things to perpetuate cultural appropriation and racism too. And I'm open to hearing those things as well. And I will also continue working on doing better. Like, I am always in self-examination about that. I mentioned earlier about how when we released our episode on Sephora's Witch Kit, about how I have just been like sitting on this episode on cultural appropriation this whole time because I just didn't feel like I was ready enough or good enough to talk to other people about cultural appropriation. But I realized, like, I'm never going to be good enough in my mind. You guys know I have a stellium in Virgo, so being good enough is like this thing I'm obsessed with, but also completely and totally aware that I cannot achieve. So like at some point you just gotta break stuff, right? You just gotta go for it and like know it's not gonna be perfect, and then put it out there and know that you're going to just do better in the future. And so that's what this podcast is about. I know it's not perfect. I hope it's really good information for you. I hope we can get a discussion going. I hope that you've learned a lot. I hope that you enjoy your smoke cleansing from here on out. I hope you understand that you can share in other people's cultures. You can appreciate those cultures. You can absolutely go to festivals. Like, you can go to places where you're invited to share cultural practices with other people. And that's not a problem. Like, when you're invited to come share in other people's celebrations and rituals and whatnot, you are absolutely able to go, no matter how white you might be. It's just when you decide to take over those practices and rituals and use them to advance your own reputation, your own social standing, or your own pocketbook, that we got to start looking at you and being like, are you taking opportunities away from other people? Are you making yourself bigger and making gains in a way that people from that culture cannot do so themselves? Like, are you going to be the white person who opens up an Indian restaurant and then takes away the business from the Indian people who would like to open an Indian restaurant because people with the money are just going to trust you more because you happen to be white? Is that what's going on? So yeah, it's a lot of judgment to make, and there's a lot of gray areas, and sometimes you're not going to know what to do, and sometimes you're going to fuck it up, but when you know better, you do better, and that's the way it is. So we're all kind of exploring it and feeling it out, and there's no consensus in the world, but most of us agree on some basic tenets and guidelines, and so I'm going to include some resources in the notes for you below, because I know it really is a lot to try to digest and understand. And remember, I am not saying that you cannot do the things that you love, because doing the things that you love from other cultures is cultural appreciation. Remember, this dynamic is about taking things from another culture and then profiting in some way from them, be that by reputation or by dollar or by whatever, profiting in some outward way from them. You can participate in other cultural aspects from other cultures that are not yours. If you are in the dominant culture, you just need to be mindful of when you're benefiting in an unfair way from doing so. And that's what we really want to be aware of. When we're doing things that culture, we're taking taking from cannot participate in or cannot benefit from, that's when we really have to be mindful of what we're doing. And then we really want to lift up those people and make sure they have those opportunities as well. Hope that we learned a lot. I hope that we can discuss it more. If you have questions or comments, put them in the comments below. And like I said, I'm going to put a lot of resources down there for you guys. And we'll talk to you later.
Thank you for listening to the We Witches 3 podcast. For show notes and links, please go to www.wewitches3.com.